Aloha, everyone, and welcome to another conversation from anxiety to clarity. I'm Beth-Ann Kozlovich, and this joint project has been arranged and produced by my colleague, Trisha Kajimura from Sutter Kahi, Mohala, and with Evan Leong from Brain Gain Hawaii, and me. And our hope is that these conversations are helpful and hopeful as we all learn how to deal with COVID-19 and ongoing life, knowing that we're going to be living a very changed existence. So where are we now? Well, the state is pretty much open to itself. Neighbor Island travel and gyms, some movie theaters and some museums are now allowed to open to the public. Masking and distancing ongoing, and everything seems to have the veil of normalcy about it, except for the legions of tourists and the dollars that they bring that stoke the state's economy. That is very, very changed. And how that will open to Trans-Pacific visitors, well, we really don't know that yet. Lots of conversation, but no real firm plan or date for that announced as of this time. So, well, with Hawaii looking very different than it did 10 weeks ago when we began this series, we thought we would circle back and have another conversation with psychologist Dr. Martin Johnson, who joined us for our very first conversation. He's the founder of the Hawaii Center for Psychology, and it's always good to have a conversation with Dr. Johnson. Martin, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thanks for having me, Beth-Ann. It's good to be here.
Well, I see something very new in looking at you, that since I saw you last time. There wasn't a beard and a mustache. Was that just because you got tired of shaving, or you thought about changing your look during all of this?
Well, I blame it on my teenage son who started it. It became a father and son thing to do together, and basically just a thing to sort of mess with the boredom of the pandemic.
Well, I like that. I like that. And you've had a lot of really lovely things happen in your family in the last little while. So let me congratulate you, first of all, on all your wonderful years of marriage. You and Leah have a wonderful relationship, and it was really lovely to see what you put up on Facebook about that. And also that your son is now a bona fide 2020 high school graduate.
Yes, that was quite an event. Thank you.
So with everything that's been going on in your family, how have things been changing for you since we talked 10 weeks ago, aside from the fact that we just marked some of those milestones? But to get to that point, how has life been?
Well, you know, I think personally, it's been marked with a lot of change, as it probably has for many people. I think it's important. We've been listening to different people talk about metaphors and how unprecedented this is and all of these words. And one of the metaphors I kind of like is we're not all in the same boat, but we're all in different boats going over the same wave, right? So some of us are doing well and some of us are, having much more challenge, right? For myself as a psychotherapist and a psychologist, I went from 98% of my work being face-to-face to 100% of my work being telehealth. And that happened in about 2 weeks' time. It's interesting, as I scrambled myself to also watch my colleagues and discussion groups and really all over the country and all over the world sort of scramble and learn how to do this and sort of get that together. So I'm blessed to be in a career where my work continued largely uninterrupted, although sort of changed in format. My friends who are chiropractors and in other fields where it's really much more hands-on really don't have telehealth. And so they're just now sort of getting back to work. But actually my family has fared fairly well. It's, like any kid graduating the class of 2020, it's a unique graduation, to be kind.
Well, clearly this is going to be something etched in his memory for the rest of his life, as it is for the rest of us too. You bring up being able to continue your work through telehealth. Obviously, we're seeing a great press for that throughout medicine, and whatever one can do if one is in the medical field to be able to continue to work in that way, or just to see that something that we've been talking about for a very, very long time now had an accelerator behind it out of sheer need because they couldn't be face-to-face. Now, some things you're right, like I haven't been able to see my dentist, and they just called, and now I can't see my dentist till August because they're so backlogged. But for other parts of treatment, there have been other things that I've been able to access through telehealth too. this, for a lot of people, they think that this is a very good thing, that this is where we're going anyway. But now this just gave us a much better reason to be able to do it, to give much more access to people. Have you been able to see more people, being able to access you, maybe new patients or others that hadn't known about you before, that suddenly telehealth opened a world to?
Well, I think that's been true in general in mental health. My practice, particularly, is a kind of practice where it's really just moving from one mode to another, clicking back and forth. And for most of my clients, that's not been a difficult transition, although I have done a couple of sessions talking to a steering wheel because the client couldn't reverse their camera. So we've all had our challenges. But in my personal practice, that made a big difference. But I think you're right. It's been an accelerant in some areas of healthcare and also other economic areas. My wife is a retailer. She was closed temporarily, got reopened, and now the majority of her business is done online and through social media, which is a huge shift for them. And something they were sort of thinking they were going to eventually have to get to, and now suddenly 2 months later they are there. So I think for a lot of the society, there's, we all read the stories. There's a lot of businesses where people have been working from home, and as they sort of have the option of coming back, now they're letting it be an option, and deciding whether or not they want everybody in the office. So I think it has moved a lot of things forward sort of rapidly. And while it has been a great disruption and it caused a great deal of pain for many people around the world, and it's sad and it is a crisis. I think it's important at this point in time for those people, well, for all of us, to look at where, if any, upsides there are for us. Maybe it's as simple as we got to spend more time with our pet. Maybe it's not some great thing, but there's some silver linings in the cloud. And as this sort of moves into the next phase, and it's going to be prolonged, right, as we can kind of tell, it's important to start noticing what's the upside of it, right, and being willing to appreciate it. I've had several people go like, wow, I feel embarrassed to say this, but I kind of like this aspect, or this has kind of worked well for me, but I hate to say it because I don't want to sound like I'm, taking joy out of other people's pain, and that's not the point. We all have to adapt. And so we have to start finding ways that we can appreciate what we do have and what positive changes that are there for us, just so that we can kind of continue in the ambiguity.
And that's, I think, a big part of it, understanding that we are in this land of ambiguity and uncertainty, and we're dancing on shifting carpets all the time, and it's going to continue to be that way. In many ways, this feels as if it has brought life down to what really matters, the essentials. And whether people feel guilty about enjoying those little pleasures, those simple pleasures of life, or whether they don't, it's still been very much that leveler of looking at what really matters and how we get through these times and keep getting through these times, not knowing that there's going to be an end in sight. Many changes sociologically that you just mentioned, from how people work to how people buy things, to what's happening with brick and mortar that was just beyond the threat of the internet, but now really seeing what people's preferences are, how they've learned to live through all this. I mean, a lot for us to unpack there. So let's just start with some of what you began to talk about with work. We did a whole conversation about that a few weeks ago. And the idea that there may now be hybrids of people who will be in the office a certain number of hours or days a week, and then maybe at home for the rest. Other people who want to be exclusively in the office because they really need that, and other people who want to be perhaps and are allowed to be working from home exclusively, changing the whole idea of what we need for commercial real estate. But also it seems to say that we are getting a little bit better about honoring preferences and how people access their best. Are you seeing that with the people that you've been talking to, and how they are looking at going back to work or starting their careers differently, or if you're in touch with anyone in the business community?
Well, I think the honoring people's choices and how people can work best is certainly the hope, and I think there's a good chance we'll eventually get there. I think the thing I'm seeing right now is actually in the last couple of weeks, people are more stressed than they have been since the beginning of the whole pandemic. And I think that's because at the beginning, we were worried about the illness and trying to learn about it. And is it the flu? Is it more than the flu? How do people get sick? How do we wash our hands? All of those things were sort of new to us. And then we sort of settled in and hunkered down. And in Hawaii, of course, we were very fortunate. And leaders took some apparently wise choices, right? We've been very fortunate to flatten the curve. But now, in the last couple of weeks, things are starting to open up again. And I think we've all had this sort of hope, even if it wasn't fully thought through and conscious, well, it'll start to get normal, right? We can start to do our life again. And of course, as it opens up, it's better, right? We all got to go to the barber and the hairstylist. Those people are jabbed. But it certainly doesn't seem normal, and it certainly isn't clear what's next, right? Or what's the appropriate thing to do, or how do we do it, or when will it happen? So there's a ton of ambiguity, and that ambiguity makes people nervous, and it's on top of we've all been locked down for 2 to 3 months. So what I'm seeing is there's an increase in anxiety and stress. People generally don't attribute it to the pandemic. They attribute it to whatever's in front of their nose, right? It's my marriage, it's my kid, it's my job, it's my family, it's, whatever is life for them, right? But it's all built on this increased level of anxiety of like extended ambiguity and not knowing when it's going to start to settle down. And I think we're kind of out of the beginning or at the end of the beginning, and we're going into a middle phase, right? And we don't know how long the middle phase will last. But I would arbitrarily mark the end of the middle will be when a vaccine shows up, or when an effective way to sort of manage and dampen the pandemic shows up. And we have no way of knowing when that is.
So how are you turning people back to the idea that this is pandemic based? It's not the marriage, the child, the whatever it is that they think is right in front of their nose, but really get them to look underneath that and make them understand that there's more at work here than just what's been happening necessarily in their own household. That maybe might be the more fixable thing. I mean, you can leave a marriage, you can reprimand a child or cut a child off if they're in college, or whatever things that a parent may feel punitive as they are, at least they can work on that or fix it. Or they can choose to work on the marriage or work on the relationship. But those are all good things, but it won't necessarily address that underlying, roiling sea of ambiguity that none of us knows really, how deep it will be or how wide it will be and how long we'll be riding on it.
Well, there's a bad joke going around, and it goes like this. Patient says, doctor, I'm very concerned. I'm having trouble concentrating. The doctor says, well, we are going through a global pandemic. And the patient goes, yeah. But doctor, I'm not sleeping well. And the doctor goes, well, we are going through a global pandemic. And the patient goes, yeah, doc, but I'm so irritable. My spouse can't stand it. And the doctor goes, hello, is my microphone on? Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Okay. So what I do is the thing that the person needs to deal with, of course, is the stuff in their life, right? But it helps if we can give ourselves a little compassion and a little context that the reason we're more irritable, the reason we're not sleeping, has to do with the pandemic. And there are things we can do to help us cope with the ambiguity. I noticed, when last time we spoke, we talked a lot about structure and sort of creating a little project you can do that you can control, right? And there was a lot of hoarding going on at the time. The toilet paper was gone. There was all this sort of silliness, right? That really wasn't relevant, but people were just scared, right? What I noticed
they were acting in ways that they knew how to act because they didn't have any experience with this. So if there's a disaster, you go buy toilet paper and rice, right?
Right, exactly, precisely. And what I noticed is we've gone forward. The hoarding stopped. That's great. But we did briefly run out of flour. And now I understand there's not a lot of yeast, right? Because people are home baking, right? People are also having trouble getting jigsaw puzzles online because they're selling out, right? Why? Because these are concrete things we can do at home, whether it's baking a loaf of bread, or putting together a jigsaw puzzle, where our mind can rest. We can focus on something we control that's predictable, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when we're done, we can enjoy eating and sharing the bread for a day or so. We can enjoy
Right.
leaving the puzzle up and feeling like we accomplished something. And
It's
that is
productive.
healthy for us. Right. It is healthy for us neurologically and emotionally to kind of have a break from the ambiguity. Right. So, that and playing games and laughter and social connection. Again, I really wish whoever came up with it had said physical distancing and not social distancing, right? For those of us who work now through the screen on a regular basis, it seems sometimes like the last thing we want to do is have a Zoom cocktail hour after work because we're tired of looking at this thing. But I'm
Yeah, Zoom
telling you,
fatigue is a big thing.
it is a thing, right? But I'm telling you, it's different when it's social, right? And it's so important to just reaffirm those connections, right? And be in connection with other people and hear their story and realize, oh, that's not so different from my story, or I can understand it from my perspective. And it starts to be, we're not so alone with it.
Interestingly enough, I was talking to my son who is in the Bay Area and hunkered down. And I said, well, I miss seeing you. Would you like to do a Zoom meeting instead of a telephone call? I said, actually, Mom, I really want to just close my eyes and talk to you. And I don't
Right,
want to be looking at a screen. And I thought that
right.
was so interesting because, clearly a
Mhm.
millennial kid, and he just said to me, I'm looking at screens all the time. I've got Zoom meetings all the time. I just would like to talk to you and close my eyes. I thought that's pretty interesting.
Well, for some of us boomer parents, as music to our ears, we were trying to get them off the screen time for the last 20 years. So maybe they're finally screened out.
Learning a lesson. Yeah, exactly.
Right. But yes, it is a huge change. And, I think, there's going to be technological changes. I'm in a home office now. I'm about to get a large screen in my home office instead of the small screen. It's just sort of those little things to sort of like, well, this is real now. This is, right? We need to now make the most of our new reality, right?
Yeah.
And first of all, we have to accept that this is going to be part of the new reality.
Right. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about next, because for a lot of people, there is this wish, however it may or may not be expressed, that somehow we are going to return to normal, even though they hear the rhetoric that says, no, that's not going to be possible, or certainly not possible until we have a vaccine. And,
Mhm.
who knows where that is. So they're looking a year out, 18 months out, and figuring like the clock is ticking and if we can get through this. And there's this arbitrary sense in their minds that, well, that's where we're going to place it. And once we get that vaccine, then life will return to normal. But in that ensuing period, we're going to see a lot of change, and the
Mhm.
changes that we've been building on by the very changes that we've seen brought by our lifestyles under COVID-19. And so I'm wondering how, with all of this wish, however expressed or not, to have some sense of normalcy, how is it that we get to people who are not necessarily going to be able to have any sense of a previous normalcy? Because we still have so many people out of work. We have many people who are now looking to leave Hawaii because they're not sure they're going to be able to go back to a job because that job doesn't exist anymore. And jobs
Right.
are changing. And they're not quite sure that they want to be here. Or maybe they've discovered that they're far away from family and they need to be with aging parents on the mainland, or just wanting to be closer to family on the mainland. Lots and lots of changes. How do we get through to a lot of people for whom any return to some sort of normalcy, albeit tweaks or not, is not necessarily going to be a reality?
Well, I think, when I'm working with people, I try to acknowledge that it's not normal. It doesn't feel normal. It feels odd, right? It just normalize the discomfort with things, but then sort of move away from normal and start to get to what is. And as you mentioned, many people are in pivots. They're in pivots professionally. They're in pivots in terms of their own values. Like, wow, I was busy as heck. What was I doing? I kind of like not having, eating at home and having a little more time, right? It's like, so what was, there's a reevaluation of things, career and otherwise. And then I think it's important to start moving forward we can't wait until it's all spelled out for us. But in some area, so maybe you take an online class if you're interested in this new area. Maybe you look online for an online job part-time. Maybe you do a side gig. Maybe you talk to your spouse about really where do you want to live and why and how do you want to live, right? Just start formulating for yourself and taking small steps forward and exploring. Because otherwise we sit back and wait for the world to get normal. And that, that's not a great strategy, right?
No.
There was a book, decades ago, I think the guy's name was Robert Johnson, no relation, I promise you. Who Moved My Cheese, right? Classic book, right? About two little mice, Em and Haw, and how they dealt with big change in their lives, right? So I think it is time to sort of, take the world into our own hands in terms of our world. What was important to us, what direction we want to move, and begin to move in that direction, and sort of take baby steps. We'll feel better, right? Because waiting for it all to clear up is, it's going to be a long time, and we don't know how it's going to clear up. I do remind people historically, because, for those of us who are nerdy enough to look at things like that, right? After the plague came the Renaissance. And after the Spanish flu of 1918 came the Roaring '20s, right? So I'm just going to choose to believe that 5 years from now things are going to be pretty awesome, right? If that's the pattern.
It's also good to be that optimistic and look forward something and look forward to betterment in some way. But the bottom line of what I hear you say and what's I'm seeing happen in other people's lives is that they're not waiting. The choice to not wait, and whether that's to look at all the things you just talked about or to choose to get married. Just talked to a friend whose nephew and his fiance had planned to be married in a couple of weeks, and they're going through with it. And they had thankfully had chosen to be married in a family home in a backyard and all that. That makes it a little easier when you've got the venue.
Right, sure.
But they've also said, if 5 people show up, it's great. If 50 people show up, it's great. If nobody shows up, it's great. They just had this incredibly healthy attitude that most people going into a wedding usually don't have. And to me, that was a really great harbinger of potentially a fabulous marriage, that they can be weathering all of this and realize that it's the marriage, not the wedding. Some people are choosing to wait, until it's safer. Some people don't have a choice because the venues that they wanted are closed, and many things like that are on the periphery of what the marriage would always be about, the two people. But it's just interesting to see some of these very clear decisions that people have made to not wait and to live their lives, because life is still passing every single day. And I think it's a really healthy place.
Right. And for some people, the decision to go ahead with the marriage is a great decision. And for other people, the decision to wait on the marriage may be the thing they need to do, but there may be other areas or elements in their lives that they can begin to move forward with. And I think the point is to scan your life and see where you can begin to take some positive steps.
In scanning your life, it really means you have to be pretty honest with yourself. And one of the things that is toughest for a lot of people to do is to be very honest with themselves and take a good deep look and not simply fob something off or create an excuse for it. Are we getting better at that because of the pandemic? Has that also brought a sense of not just being able to focus on the simple things, the good things, understanding what we may like or not like, but really create some better understanding of ourselves?
Well, it certainly created an opportunity for self-reflection. And I think a lot of people are taking advantage of that, largely because everything we were planning on just came to a screeching halt for many of us. For others, it's like, I work with some people in the medical field and in other areas, certainly financial field. Oh my goodness, they are just working themselves to death. They just can't keep up with things, right? So again, like I say, we speak in generalities, but we're all in very different boats on this very big wave. But yes, I think generally people are sort of reflecting on it. Even some of these people that are working themselves to the bone,
I was
When
going
they
to ask,
do,
asking, do they want to do that?
right, yeah, right. And why are they doing that? And what do they, what are their reasons for doing that? So yeah, I think it does make us all question, and that creates the opportunity for self-reflection. And as was said a couple of times in different ways, that I'm dealing a little more with existential crisis than I usually do in my practice. What does it all mean? Why am I doing
Right.
this? I don't really care
Exactly.
about.
And, not to go further down the existential rabbit hole, but, there are some people who believe that this is now a real turning point for society in the ways that you talked about what happened, when we look back over our shoulder at what had happened after the plague, after we came through the flu, all of it, that these were real pivots and hard pivots, but
Right.
they somehow made society better because of it. That also says that we have a lot of collateral damage in doing some of this, because that's going to be just the nature of it, and understanding that there are positives and negatives on both sides of the equation, both economically and certainly when it comes to public health. But the greater understanding, I think, has to be that because you've got damage on both sides, that you can't have one without the other, and that there's going to be plenty of both as we do this hard pivot, because this is not just one localized area. This is something, that's why we call it a pandemic. It's happening around the world, and it's going to be a hard shift. That's a much tougher concept for people to get around. What words of advice would you give them as they look at the enormity of that, and what that means to truly understand that we're going to have more cases, we're going to have more economic hardship, things are going to be different? We talked a lot about the good things. What do you tell them in dealing with the not so good things?
Well, I think I tend to classify change into four categories, right? And there's the good stuff that we had something to do with, and that we call growth, because we did good stuff and we got good stuff for it. And there's good stuff sometimes happens to us and we didn't have much to do with it. We'll call it luck. And now what we're talking about is when things aren't so great, right? If we're the cause and we made a mistake, we need to re-examine it, learn from it, make some changes, right? Mm. And then the other thing is when bad things happen to us, we had nothing to do with it. It's trauma of one kind or another, big T, little t, right? And then there's some grieving to do, right? There's some healing to do, right? There's oftentimes this sort of leads us to spirituality or religion, right? Like, what do we trust in the universe? What do we trust in the world? Right? And so, as we look at all four kinds of change, right? We have to, I encourage everyone to make the growth part their focus, but don't ignore the others, right? So, the trauma for us is in multiple ways. There's a loss of a sense of security. We took a lot for granted, right? Of course, we're going to graduate the normal way. Of course, we're going to, our business will continue in the normal course, so to speak. Of course, we'll be able to hug our grandparents. Of course, and well, I guess not, right? And those are losses. I'm constantly reminding people that it's normal to cry. And sometimes they're not even telling me they're crying. And then they go, they're relieved. Like, really? Like, I didn't want to tell you. I thought you'd think I'm a therapist. What do you think I'm going to think? But they're embarrassed to tell their therapist that they're sort of spontaneously crying a couple times. Like, that's pretty normal because of the enormity of both loss and uncertainty.
We talked a lot about loss last time, and that was one of the conversations that even after we spoke began to resonate with other people who saw that particular video, and even in conversations that they had again with me. And perhaps that's the part that we need to continually underscore, that there is loss, even with all the changes, good or bad, even with the reflections for good or for not so good, understanding that all of this sea change is happening, it still means loss. Every time you move from one phase to another, you've lost something in the game. And that's not necessarily something we talk a lot about, even though we kind of know it, but we don't really talk about it as much as I think we're talking about it now. That I put into a win, because life is all about change. As my grandmother used to tell me, nothing endureth like change, so you better make friends with it. Not easy to do, not easy to do.
Right. I think being able to talk about our sadness, being able to talk about our loss with friends and loved ones, with a therapist if you sort of need to find someone else to talk to it about, because maybe your loved ones are also heavily burdened and you are concerned about burdening them. Although usually sharing it is less of a burden than we imagine. But yeah, with a therapist, with loved ones, in safe places, being able to share that and express it and get it out really does, it's just healthy for us. It's a normal part of human life. And when we're facing massive amounts of change, right? I think the other thing we're seeing, and I think you touched on it a moment ago, is we're seeing societal change, right? We're seeing as people are stressed and bad things are happening, and we have sort of a reflective moment to sort of look at it, for some of us with new eyes. Some of us is like, what are you talking about, new eyes? We haven't seen this in a long time. It's like, okay, fair enough. But we're sort of looking at criminal justice differently. We're looking at race relationships differently. And I think that's all, potentially positive in the long run, and, disruptive and upsetting and emotional and difficult for many people in the short run. But again, as you talk about, these large disruptions have moved societies forward. I think there's hope that this will move us forward.
I think a lot of people are hoping that, but it's going to be a rocky road, because one of the fundamental questions I hear people asking and have had conversations too quietly is, what does this mean anymore to be an American? Looking at inequality, looking at social justice issues, looking at the television, you can't have it on for a few minutes before something comes up to remind you that this is not the America of your grandparents or your great grandparents. Not that maybe that was so terrific unless you were in a particular strata. But really making us look at who we are. Even the issue of masking, the idea of masking was meant to protect other people, not necessarily to keep yourself safe, but to express the idea that I'm doing this for you and for my community. And those people who say, no, I'm not going to do that, really, it's a true reflection of how they feel about the rest of their community and what they think about themselves. And that sense of looking in that American mirror too, where we used to feel that we're kind of all in this together, where that was very much a part of the way the war efforts were structured in the Second World War in particular. And as now those generations are dying off, and we're seeing real change in how people regard themselves as Americans, as people in the community, really there's a whole lot to be able to disentangle from all of that. But the bottom line that you mentioned is really being able to look at this as a fundamental change or a societal change in which we have a part. And the question is, what are we going to do and how are we going to do it? And hopefully with the least amount of damage to other people, because heaven knows we're getting plenty of damage from COVID-19.
Yes, right. Sure.
I know that we've been talking for a while about this. Wait, were you about to say something?
No, just that, I think one of the things that is being laid clear is how many different perspectives Americans have on our American life. And some might say some people have a very narrow perspective, right? And it's easy to sort of then judge that harshly. Certainly perspectives need to change, and people need to listen, and people need to learn, and people become more sensitive and more empathic and more supportive and more egalitarian, right? As that's stating some very simple things, but apparently very necessary things. We're not nearly as far there as some people thought. And other people, again, have been having a different experience and going like, what are you talking about? This is not new news, folks. So, as we sort of come round those, right, it's sort of important, I think, to meet people where they are and then help people to increase their understanding and widen their view. And it's very easy to fall into anger and judgment, and I'm not speaking about what you just said, but sort of what we see, right, in our society. And to the extent that we fall into anger and judgment and harshness, we all have a right to our feelings and our angers. but in terms of the exchange, right? I think in terms of moving forward, when we're able to minimize when we're able to better meet people where they are and help them to come to a greater understanding, then I think we're in better shape.
I agree with you with that. I think the corollary to that is also being able to meet ourselves where we really are, not where we think we are or where we would like to be, but getting to that very vulnerable, honest place and being able to say, even now when suddenly an idea pops up or a judgment pops up, and say, wait a minute, why do I think that? I've gotten a lot better about that. And I thought I was pretty good about that before, but sometimes these things just come up unbidden in a certain situation because suddenly it's ripe for that to happen. And it's been there all along, but maybe we haven't paid very much attention to it. And it's also good to know that it's okay to cry a little over yourself not being the person you thought that you were, but then to take the opportunity to be something better. And for me personally, that's what a lot of this exercise has been in staying at home and having to reconcile some things that I thought I had reconciled a long time ago. And so I've been very grateful for the time to be able to do that. And I hope that there will be a lot of those, silver linings for people going forward, as we talked about before. Any final thoughts from you before we close it up for today?
Well, I think it's, coming off of what you just said, as a therapist, therapy is largely about bumping into our sort of unconscious or out of conscious, out of awareness preconceptions of things that we just operate as if that's just the way it is. And because that's just, we operate like that's the way it is, we don't re-examine them often.
Right.
And when we have these kinds of large disruptions in our society and in our lives, right, it's a great time to sort of bump into those. And usually it's somewhat painful when we do that. And sometimes it's enlightening, and sometimes it's disappointing, and sometimes it's just sort of surprising, right? But I think
sometimes it's all of those things.
Exactly.
At once.
I think as you've been saying, it's a very healthy process, and it's a great time to sort of engage in it as we reevaluate our assumptions and try to move forward in the best possible way.
Well, Martin, thank you very much for another very insightful conversation. And I look forward to our next one. Meanwhile, all the best to you and your family. Stay well and healthy. And we will talk to you sometime soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Beth-Ann.
And for those of you joining us today, thanks very much for being here for this conversation from anxiety to clarity. We hope you'll join us next week as we take another run at it from a different perspective. And if you have a particular topic you'd like us to tackle, or you have a question, send it in. You can reach me at KozlovB, that's K-O-Z as in zebra, L-O-V as in Victor, B as in boy, at sutterhealth.org. KozlovB at sutterhealth.org, and we will get back to you. Meanwhile, make it a good week, and we'll see you next time for another conversation from anxiety to clarity.